I was standing knee-deep in the freezing waters of Blackthorn Cove, my fingers raw and numb from hours of pulling in empty fishing nets. The storm clouds were closing in, and the wind screamed like 1,000 voices, warning me to head back to shore. But giving up wasn't an option. Not for someone like me who had debts piling up like a mountain and a mother battling a disease we could barely afford to name, let alone treat. Just as I was ready to reel in the last net, hoping for at least a few measly fish to make the day worth it, a frantic scream sliced through the air. It was faint, barely audible over the roar of the waves, but unmistakable. I froze, scanning the horizon, my pulse hammering in my ears. There, a few hundred yards away, a figure was thrashing in the water, arms flailing against the relentless tide. I didn't think. I couldn't afford to. My boat wasn't built for heroics, but I steered it toward the figure with every ounce of strength I had left. The closer I got, the clearer it became. It was a woman, her face pale as a ghost, her movements slowing as exhaustion took over. "Hold on," I shouted, though the wind likely carried my words away. I threw a rope into the water, but her grip slipped, her eyes wide with terror as she began to sink. Without hesitation, I dove in, the icy water stabbing at my skin like 1,000 needles. I fought the waves, reaching her just as her head dipped below the surface. When I grabbed her wrist, it felt like holding a thread about to snap. She was unconscious by the time I hauled her onto my boat, her lips blue, her body limp. I covered her with the only blanket I had and started CPR, praying to a God I wasn't sure I believed in anymore. She sputtered and coughed after what felt like an eternity, her wide, terrified eyes locking onto mine. "You're okay," I said, my voice trembling as much as my hands. "You're safe now." Her voice was barely a whisper. "Thank you." The woman's words were faint, but they hit me like a wave. I nodded, focusing on steering the boat back to shore while she lay bundled in the blanket. Her eyes fluttered shut, and for a moment, I feared she might slip away again. "Hey, stay with me," I called, my voice sharp with urgency. "What's your name?" Her eyes cracked open, but her response was barely audible. "Sophia," she coughed, her body trembling violently from the cold. "All right, Sophia, just hold on," I said, though the boat groaned against the surging waves, and I wasn't entirely sure we'd make it back in one piece. My hands gripped the wheel so tight that my knuckles ached, but I refused to let fear take hold. By the time we reached the dock, the storm was in full force. Rain pelted down in relentless sheets, and the wooden planks creaked under the weight of the tide. I carried her off the boat, my muscles screaming in protest, and made my way to the small shack I called home. It wasn't much, just one room with peeling walls and a rusting heater, but it was dry and warm. I laid her down on the old couch, covering her with another blanket. She murmured something unintelligible, her face pale and drawn. I knew she needed a doctor, but there wasn't one for miles, and I didn't have the kind of money they'd demand. Instead, I worked with what I had: a hot bowl of soup, dry clothes, and an old heater I prayed wouldn't give out. Slowly, the color returned to her cheeks, and her shivers lessened. She opened her eyes fully for the first time, her gaze scanning the room before landing on me. You saved me," she said, her voice hoarse. "Wasn't gonna let you drown," I replied, trying to downplay the situation. But the truth was, I'd never been that close to losing someone before, and it shook me more than I wanted to admit. "Why did you?" she started, but her voice trailed off as her brows furrowed, like she was piecing something together. "You could have died out there," maybe, I said, shrugging. "But I couldn't just watch." For a long moment, she just stared at me, her expression unreadable. Then she whispered, "You don't even know who I am." I raised an eyebrow. Should I? A flicker of something, fear? Regret? Crossed her face, but she quickly masked it. "No," she said, shaking her head. "I'm no one." Over the next few days, Sophia recovered quickly. She was stronger than I'd first thought, her resilience shining through despite the obvious weight she carried. She didn't talk much about herself, though. Every question I asked was met with vague answers or nervous deflections. It wasn't until I found her standing at the edge of the dock one morning, staring out at the horizon, that she let her guard slip. I ran away, she admitted, her voice barely louder than the waves. From what? I asked, stepping closer. Her shoulders tensed, and for a moment, I thought she wouldn't answer. Then she turned to me, her eyes filled with a mix of defiance and desperation. From a life I didn't choose. From people who only see me as a pawn in their game. I frowned, trying to piece it together. What kind of life are we talking about? She hesitated, then sighed. My father, he's powerful. Too powerful. And he thinks that gives him the right to control everything, including me. Her words hung heavy in the air, and I could see the pain etched into her features. I didn't press further, sensing that she wasn't ready to share more. But the revelation left me unsettled. Who was this woman I'd saved? And what kind of danger had I unwittingly brought into my life? A few days later, the peaceful rhythm of my small fishing village was shattered. It started with strangers, men in sharp suits and dark sunglasses, walking the docks as though they owned the place. Their polished shoes were out of place among the mud and salt-stained wood. I first noticed them while I was repairing my net. They moved in pairs, scanning the area like wolves on a hunt. Something wasn't right. I hurried back to my shack, my gut churning with unease. When I stepped inside, I found Sophia standing by the window, her face pale as she peeked through the curtains. "They're here," she whispered. I dropped the tools in my hand. "Who's here?" She turned to me, her expression filled with fear. "My father's men. They'll take me back." "Take you back? To what?" I demanded, though I already had a sinking feeling I knew the answer. She hesitated, but there was no time for lies anymore. "To the life I told you about. He controls everything, me, my future, who I marry. If they find me, I'll lose everything I've fought for." Her words hit me like a punch. This wasn't just about a family dispute. It was something deeper, something darker. "What do we do?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady even as my pulse raced. Her gaze darted around the room, as though searching for an escape route. "We run," she said firmly. "It's the only way." I didn't have time to argue. The sound of approaching footsteps and muffled voices was enough to set us both into motion. Grabbing my jacket and whatever cash I had stashed away, I followed Sophia out the back door. The rain had started again, making the alley behind my shack slick and treacherous. We darted through the narrow streets of the village, keeping to the shadows. My heart pounded with every step, the sound of heavy boots and sharp commands growing closer behind us. Whoever these men were, they weren't amateurs. They moved with precision, their voices crackling over radios as they coordinated their search. "Over here," I whispered, pulling Sophia into an old storage shed near the docks. The place smelled of salt and decay, but it offered cover. Sophia was trembling, her breath coming in sharp gasps. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice cracking. "I didn't mean to drag you into this." I shook my head. "You didn't drag me into anything. I'm here because I want to be. We'll get through this." Her eyes met mine, and for a moment, the fear melted away. But it was short-lived. A sudden crash outside the shed made us both freeze. "Check in there," a voice barked. I reached for the only thing I could find, a rusted wrench hanging on the wall. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. Sophia's grip tightened on my arm as the footsteps drew closer. The door creaked open, and I lunged without thinking, swinging the wrench with all my strength. The man standing there barely had time to react before the blow sent him stumbling backward. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Sophia's hand and pulling her out of the shed. We didn't stop running until we reached the edge of the village, where an old, abandoned fishing boat sat half-submerged in the mud. It wasn't seaworthy, but it offered a place to hide. We climbed inside, my chest heaving with exhaustion as I tried to catch my breath. Sophia leaned against the hull, her face pale but determined. "They'll keep coming," she said. "They won't stop until they find me." "Then we'll make sure they don't," I replied, though I wasn't sure how. All I knew was that I couldn't let them take her. As we sat there in the darkness, the gravity of the situation settled over us. This wasn't just about survival, it was about freedom. For both of us. "I'm not going back," Sophia said, her voice filled with a quiet resolve. "I'd rather die than let him control me again." Her words ignited something in me. For the first time in years, I felt a purpose beyond mere survival. This wasn't just her fight anymore, it was ours. The storm raged on outside the decrepit fishing boat, but it was nothing compared to the storm brewing in my mind. Sophia's words echoed in my head. I'd rather die than let him control me again. There was something haunting about the way she said it, a mix of defiance and despair. It struck a nerve I didn't know I had. "We can't hide forever," I finally said, breaking the tense silence. "They'll search every inch of this village until they find you." Sophia hugged her knees to her chest, her eyes distant. "Then we leave." "And go where?" I asked, not meaning to sound doubtful but failing miserably. "If your father has men like that on his payroll, I'm guessing he's got resources everywhere." She didn't answer immediately. Instead, her gaze flickered toward the horizon. "There's a city 2 towns over, Sea-Watch. I have a friend there, someone I can trust. If we can get there, we'll have a chance." "A chance at what?" I pressed. "Sophia, I don't even know what I'm up against here. What's your father capable of?" She looked at me, her expression hardening. "Everything. Bribery, blackmail, even violence, whatever it takes to get what he wants. And what he wants is me, under his control, doing his bidding." The weight of her words hit me like a ton of bricks. This wasn't just a runaway heiress story. This was a full-blown nightmare. But there was no turning back now. I'd thrown myself into her world the moment I pulled her out of the water, and something deep inside told me I couldn't walk away. "Sea-Watch, then," I said, my voice firm. "But we'll have to be smart about it. Those men are probably watching the roads, maybe even the docks." Sophia nodded, determination sparking in her eyes. "We'll find a way." We spent the night planning our escape, whispering in the darkness as the rain drummed against the boat's hull. At first light, we slipped out, sticking to the shadows as we made our way toward the outskirts of the village. Sophia had traded her soaked dress for an old set of clothes I had lying around. Baggy jeans and a worn hoodie that hid her delicate features. I couldn't help but notice the tension in her every move. She was trying to blend in, but her posture, her way of walking, it screamed she wasn't from a place like this. It wasn't arrogance, far from it. It was more like she didn't know how to fade into the background, like she'd spent her whole life under a spotlight. We avoided the main roads, cutting through dense forests and overgrown trails. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made my heart race, but we pressed on. It wasn't until we reached the edge of the forest that our luck ran out. "There they are," a voice shouted from behind us. I whipped around to see 2 men emerging from the trees, guns drawn. My stomach dropped. These weren't just hired goons, they were professionals, the kind who didn't miss. "Run!" I yelled, grabbing Sophia's hand and sprinting toward the open field ahead. Bullets tore through the air, hitting the ground inches from our feet. My lungs burned as we ran, adrenaline surging through my veins. Ahead, I spotted an old barn, its weathered structure barely standing against the wind. It wasn't much, but it was the only cover in sight. We dove inside, slamming the rickety door shut behind us. My heart pounded as I scanned the room for anything we could use. A pile of hay, broken tools, and, thankfully, an old ladder leading up to the loft. "Up there," I whispered, pushing Sophia toward the ladder. We climbed up, the wood creaking under our weight. Just as we reached the loft, the barn door burst open, and the 2 men stormed in. "Check everywhere," one of them barked. Sophia and I pressed ourselves against the wall, trying to stay out of sight. My hand brushed against something metal, a rusted pitchfork. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. As the men approached, I gripped the pitchfork tightly, ready to defend Sophia with everything I had. But before they could reach the loft, the sound of sirens pierced the air. The men froze, exchanging a glance before one of them cursed under his breath. "Cops," he hissed. "We need to go." They retreated as quickly as they'd come, leaving the barn eerily silent. I let out a shaky breath, my grip on the pitchfork loosening. "Are you okay?" I asked Sophia, turning to her. She nodded, but her hands were trembling. "They're not going to stop," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "They'll keep coming." Sophia's words proved to be true. Every step closer to Sea-Watch brought new dangers. More men, more close calls, and the constant threat of betrayal. But along the way, we also grew closer. I began to see the cracks in her polished exterior, the vulnerability she tried so hard to hide. And she saw parts of me I'd long buried. My fears, my regrets, and my determination to protect her at all costs. The journey was far from over, and I knew the worst was yet to come. But for the first time in years, I felt alive. This fight wasn't just hers anymore, it was ours. And no matter what it took, I was going to make sure she got her freedom. We stayed in that barn until nightfall, using the cover of darkness to slip back onto the road. Every step we took was heavier. Every shadow seemed alive with danger. Sophia remained quiet, her expression a mix of fear and determination, while I kept scanning our surroundings, ready to spring into action at the first sign of trouble. The journey to Sea-Watch felt like walking a razor's edge. Every mile brought more questions. Who was her friend? Could they really help us? And how much longer could we keep outrunning the men her father had sent? But one thing was clear, there was no turning back. We reached an old railway bridge just as the moon broke through the clouds. Its rusted beams stretched out over a deep gorge, the river below roaring like a beast. I hesitated for a moment, unsure if the structure could hold our weight. "Is this safe?" Sophia asked, her voice trembling. I glanced at the bridge, then back at her. "No, but it's our best shot." We started across, the boards creaking beneath our feet. Halfway through, the sound of tires crunching on gravel made us freeze. I turned to see two black SUVs pulling up on the far side of the gorge. Doors slammed, and men poured out, their flashlights slicing through the darkness. "Go!" I shouted, grabbing Sophia's hand. We sprinted the rest of the way, the bridge swaying dangerously with each step. Bullets ricocheted off the metal beams as the men opened fire. My heart pounded as we reached the other side and ducked into the dense forest beyond. "Don't stop," I urged, pulling Sophia along as the sound of shouting and heavy footsteps grew closer. We ran until our lungs burned and our legs threatened to give out. Finally, we stumbled into a clearing and collapsed behind a cluster of boulders. I could hear the men searching nearby, their voices sharp and angry. Sophia leaned against the rock, her face pale. "We can't keep running like this." "We don't have a choice," I said, though I knew she was right. We were running on borrowed time, and sooner or later they were going to catch up. After hours of hiding and dodging patrols, we found a small cabin tucked away in the woods. It looked abandoned, but it was shelter, and we needed a place to regroup. Inside, we found a dusty fireplace, an old table, and a rickety bed. It wasn't much, but it was enough. As I lit a fire, Sophia sat on the bed, her hands trembling. "I never told you the whole story," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I turned to her, waiting. "My father, he's not just a billionaire. He's dangerous. He built his empire on lies, corruption, and violence. Anyone who gets in his way disappears. And he expects me to be part of it, to marry someone who can expand his power." Her voice broke, and she looked away. I didn't just run away from him. I ran away from everything he stands for. If he finds me, he won't just drag me back. He'll make an example of me. Her words sent a chill down my spine. This wasn't just a rich girl escaping an overbearing parent. This was life or death. "You're not going back," I said firmly. "Not while I'm around." Sophia met my gaze, and for the first time, I saw a glimmer of hope in her eyes. "Why are you helping me?" she asked softly. I hesitated. The truth was, I didn't have an answer. Maybe it was guilt for all the people I hadn't been able to save in my own life. Maybe it was something about her, the way she refused to give up, even when the odds were stacked against her. Or maybe it was just that I couldn't stand the thought of her facing this alone. "Because you deserve a chance to live your own life," I finally said. "No one has the right to take that from you." We left the cabin before dawn, sticking to the forest as we made our way towards Sea-Watch. But as we reached the outskirts of the city, our luck ran out again. A roadblock loomed ahead, with more of her father's men patrolling the area. "We can't go through," I said, pulling Sophia into the shadows. "Then how do we get in?" she asked, her voice laced with desperation. I scanned the area, my mind racing. Then I spotted an old drainage tunnel running beneath the road. It was narrow and filthy, but it led directly into the city. "This way," I said, leading her to the tunnel. The crawl through the tunnel was claustrophobic and miserable, but it worked. We emerged on the other side, dirty and exhausted but alive. The city stretched out before us, its lights flickering like distant stars. "Where's your friend?" I asked, wiping the grime from my face. Sophia hesitated, then pointed toward a row of high-rise apartments in the distance. "She lives there. Her name's Elena. She used to work for my family, but she left when she saw what my father was capable of. She's the only person I trust." "Then let's get to her before they do," I said. We reached Elena's apartment just before dawn, navigating through narrow alleys to avoid the eyes of Sophia's father's men. The building was old but well kept, with a heavy iron door that seemed to promise safety. Sophia knocked in a rhythm that must have been prearranged, her knuckles trembling against the wood. Moments later, the door creaked open, revealing a tall woman with sharp features and piercing eyes. She took one look at Sophia, then at me before ushering us inside. "Elena," Sophia breathed, her voice thick with relief. "I didn't know where else to go." Elena closed the door quickly, locking it behind us. "You did the right thing coming here," she said, her tone firm but tinged with worry. "But you've brought trouble with you, haven't you?" "They're after her," I said, stepping forward. "Her father sent men, dangerous ones. We need help." Elena's gaze lingered on me for a moment before she nodded. "We'll figure something out. But you need to stay out of sight. They'll be scouring the city." She led us to a small guest room, where we finally had a moment to breathe. Sophia sat on the edge of the bed, her shoulders slumping as the weight of the past few days caught up with her. "Elena can help," she said, as though trying to convince herself as much as me. "I hope so," I replied, "because we're running out of options." That night, we heard the sound of voices arguing in the next room. I crept to the door, pressing my ear against it. Elena's voice was low but urgent, and another voice, a man's, responded in a language I didn't understand. "What's wrong?" Sophia whispered, coming up behind me. "I'm not sure," I said, but the pit in my stomach told me something was very wrong. Before I could stop her, Sophia pushed the door open. Elena spun around, her face pale. Standing beside her was a man in a dark suit, his hand resting on the handle of a gun. "I'm sorry, Sophia," Elena said, her voice cracking. "I had no choice. They threatened my family." Sophia's face twisted with betrayal. You called them?" Elena stepped forward, tears streaming down her face. "I thought I could reason with them, convince them to leave you alone. But they wouldn't listen." The man raised his gun, his cold eyes fixed on Sophia. "Time to come home, Miss Larkin. Your father's waiting." Before the man could pull the trigger, I lunged at him, knocking the gun from his hand. The weapon skidded across the floor as we grappled, his fists landing heavy blows against my ribs. Sophia screamed, but I blocked it out, focusing on the fight. Elena stood frozen, guilt written all over her face, but she didn't try to help. Sophia, however, wasn't about to stand by. She grabbed a heavy vase from a nearby table and smashed it over the man's head. He crumpled to the ground, unconscious. "We have to go," I gasped, clutching my side. "Now?" Sophia grabbed my arm, and we bolted from the apartment. The streets of Sea-Watch were alive with activity, but that only made it harder to spot our pursuers. Every shadow felt like a threat, every corner a potential ambush. We didn't stop running until we reached the docks, where a small cargo ship was preparing to leave. The captain, an old friend of mine from my fishing days, agreed to let us board without asking too many questions. The ship would take us far from Sea-Watch, to a place where Sophia's father's reach wouldn't extend. But Sophia wasn't ready to leave. As we stood on the deck, the city lights fading in the distance, She turned to me with tears in her eyes. I can't keep running, she said. If I don't stand up to him now, he'll never stop. He'll hurt more people. He'll destroy more lives. You don't have to do this alone, I said, my voice firm. We'll face him together. The plan was risky, but it was the only way. We contacted her father through one of his men, claiming that Sophia was ready to return and negotiate. The meeting was set at an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city, a place where no one would hear the gunshots. When we arrived, her father was already there, surrounded by his enforcers. He was a tall, imposing man with sharp features and an air of absolute control. Sophia, he said, his voice dripping with false warmth. You've caused quite the mess. I'm not coming back, she said, standing tall despite the fear in her eyes. I'm done being your pawn. Her father laughed, a cold, mirthless sound. You think you have a choice? You belong to me. Not anymore, I said, stepping forward. She's free to live her own life. His eyes narrowed, and he motioned for his men to step forward. Take them. The fight that followed was chaotic and brutal. But this time we were ready. With the help of a hidden recording device, we had captured her father's threats and plans to eliminate anyone who opposed him. As the police burst into the warehouse, alerted by a tip I had sent earlier, her father's empire began to crumble. Sophia's father was arrested, his empire exposed for the corruption and violence it was built on. The media frenzy that followed was overwhelming, but Sophia handled it with a grace that left me in awe. She stood before the cameras and told her story, refusing to let her father's legacy define her. As for me, I returned to my quiet life by the sea, though it was anything but lonely. Sophia stayed, rebuilding her life far from her father's shadow. Together, we found something neither of us had expected, a sense of peace and maybe even a chance at happiness.